Big welcome, everybody. Happy Monday. It's April 19th. The sun is shining where I live. I hope the sun is shining where you live. It certainly has been a burst of summer weather, which is really quite lovely and needed, I would say. Good. Sunshine's always good for the soul. I'm Jennifer Patterson, joined here by ODE colleagues. Scott Nine and I will be facilitating our office hours today, and we get to spend a beautiful hour together. So we'll make it count. We've got a few updates, and then we'll really center some of your questions for our time together today. Next slide, please. The purpose of RSSL office hours, this is starting to feel pretty routine and familiar for us, but I always, just like in the classroom, we think about, who's new to us and how do we build consistency and routines and clarity and purpose. So for anybody who's new, the purpose of this time together today is to really help and support you as you implement RSSL guidance, and to really make sure that you have access to the most important updates, that you have a space where you can bring us your questions, you can share ideas, you get to hear other people's ideas. We care a lot about anchoring key values and ideas that are important, that will ground your work and finishing the school year strong. And then to create a space where it feels like there's two-way communication, because we know that there's not enough of that, and we really care about creating and cultivating a spirit of coming alongside one another in the work, understanding one another's contexts, and getting closer to serving students in the process. Next slide. So today, Scott and I will facilitate. We're joined by Ashley, Michelle, and Kyle. Big gratitude and thank you for being here. I think maybe Alexa, Dan, and Ken are here as well. So appreciation for directors from OTLA who are able to join. And the topics that we're going to talk about today are as follows. I'm going to give a brief overview. Could you change to the next slide, please? Just a brief update on TAG assessment. Also a brief update on essential skills requirements and kindergarten assessment. And then we're going to open the floor and really hear your questions, look for themes, and see what's up front for you and how we can be most responsive. Ashley's put in the slide, put the slide deck in the chat. So big thank you, Ashley, for that appreciation. So this is, many of you may know this, we're not sure, but Alexa Pearson suggested that we share this, and so wanted to appreciate it. And Alexa, if you're on, welcome to share anything additionally that I might be missing. But in March, the State Board of Ed did adopt a temporary rule that suspended TAG identification standards for the 2021 school year. So this temporary rule effectively waives TAG identification for this school year. So districts can still elect to identify students for talented and gifted programming, but they're not required to complete a district identification process for this year. And we do recommend and ask that families are notified that identification requirements will resume in the upcoming school year. Eligibility from previous years will carry over. And of course, as you know, and as is outlined in RSSL, differentiating and providing the right level of service and learning for students who are identified as talented and gifted, those requirements still stand. So Alexa, if you're listening, if you're here, anything that I missed, and any other questions around this topic?
Nothing that you missed. I'll put something in the chat that's also posted on the ODE TAG webpage that may be helpful. This information did already go out to the TAG coordinator listserv as well. So I'll put that in the chat in just a minute.
Thank you so much, Alexa. All right, next slide, please. And I don't think Dan was able to attend. So Dan, he's here? Dan, you're here. Okay, I thought you declined the meeting. Maybe I'm like delusional.
Hold on, I was being a good Boy Scout and I declined the wrong one.
Okay, that was an old meeting. All right, well, that's good. Well, Dan Farley, our Director of Assessment, is here to give 2 updates on the kindergarten assessment and essential skills. Big welcome, Dan.
All right, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Make sure I'm still unmuted. So I'm going to not bury the lead. The lead is that the State Board of Education suspended the kindergarten assessment for the fall 2021. They've also suspended the assessment of essential skills requirements for students who graduated in the 21-22 school year. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about the reasons why, the rationale behind those recommendations that ODE made, and of course are related to the board's approval. Before launching into that discussion, however, I wanted to introduce the topic of assessment and acknowledge that when we do not do well with assessment, we can cause great harm. So standardized assessments in particular have been misused in many ways, including but not limited to uses as false witness of meritocracy and also evidence of inferiority, and as a gatekeeper that limits or eliminates access to socially desired educational opportunities. So those opportunities can include placement tests that limit access to the next grade level and access to advanced math courses. They can include access to advanced placement courses and international baccalaureate courses, high school graduation, and college entrance. So all of those areas are spaces in which tests, assessments have been used in education as gatekeepers. And I believe that those are misuses of assessment results in our context, where we acknowledge that learning is a process that actually requires mistakes. And assessment results are best employed to define student strengths and also to identify the student's next step in learning. So when we deviate from that set of values, we are not leveraging assessments for their design purposes. So I'm talking about two systems of assessment with you today, both of which have served as gatekeepers, one unintentionally and one by design. And ODE asked the State Board to waive these assessment requirements for the coming year to allow our department time to connect with those who have been harmed by these systems, to sit next to them, listen to their stories, to hear about and acknowledge their strengths, and then of course to discuss what our next shared steps should be. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by talking about the concerns that surround the kindergarten assessment, acknowledging that most of you on the call have probably lived through some of these experiences, and I won't go too deep into them. Next slide, please. So on its surface, the kindergarten assessment doesn't appear to present any substantial hurdles or challenges. The content that's on the assessment seems to be content that we would be interested in: early literacy, early math, and approaches to learning. Why wouldn't we as educators be interested in data that conveys this information about our kindergarten students? And it seems simple until we look a little deeper into how the kindergarten assessment was both developed and implemented, which is where the concerns arise. Next slide, please. So one critical aspect of assessment design is that they are at their best, assessment types are at the best when they are designed to meet a single purpose. And the more purposes that an assessment is, or results generated from assessments are used for, the more sacrifices have to be made in terms of the efficacy of the design. Think about, like, as far as a metaphor or an illustration, you could think about a cross-terrain bicycle. So while a cross-terrain bicycle can be used both on and off road, it's neither as efficient as a dedicated road bike, nor as rugged as a dedicated mountain bike. So like the cross-terrain bicycle, the kindergarten assessment tried to address two purposes simultaneously, yielding, in this case, information that was applicable both to early learning programs and to the K-12 education system. And it's very difficult for an assessment to manage those two different systems. So the KA, in addition, was administered at the beginning of the school year by the kindergarten teacher. And though it was not allowed by policy, we did hear reports from concerned parents and educators that demonstrated that the assessment was often completed as the child's very first experience with school, and in many cases not by their teacher. The data collected by the kindergarten assessment in the K-12 space were typically redundant as well, as districts have several kindergarten readiness, universal screening, and progress monitoring systems that are implemented within the first months of kindergarten as well. So kindergarten was cumulatively becoming, especially the first month, like testing season, which is not how to start building care and connection. And we heard about that from multiple practitioners. We also heard from families who were shared information, which is the unintentional side effect of kindergarten assessment, that their child wasn't ready for kindergarten because they didn't do well on the kindergarten assessment. Of course, that's a complete misuse of kindergarten assessment because kindergartners are ready. The question is whether schools are ready to receive them well. Finally, there were there are actually two more points. There were multiple attempts to administer early Spanish literacy versions of the kindergarten assessment, but none of those attempts were successful. Each iteration of the Spanish early literacy measure failed to accurately assess students' Spanish literacy skills in a developmentally appropriate way. This was due in part because of the fact that Spanish has a different phonics structure that's based on syllables, which made parallel design a challenge and therefore comparability. And the other aspect of concern was that the approaches to learning measure was derived from the child behavior rating scale. And this was a scale that was not administered to students during the norming process of some of Oregon's major populations. So no students who were born in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Somalia were included in the development of the child behavior rating scale. So the observational assessment may, because of that developmental oversight, emphasize dominant cultural norms without attending to the cultural norms of Oregon's historically under. I think we have a mute needed. Okay, I'll keep going. And that concern is actually borne out in some of the data that we have garnered from the kindergarten assessment. The original intent of the OAR that the kindergarten assessment is founded in and a response to also includes the possibility of adding measures of physical and social emotional development, early literacy, language, cognition, including mathematics, and logic and reasoning. And the current kindergarten assessment focused only on social emotional development, early literacy, and math measures. So the measure itself wasn't as comprehensive as the regulation allowed for, was another more technical concern. Next slide, please. So moving forward, the assessment team needs time to engage with education and community partners to determine the factors that are of greatest concern to our educators, to our communities of color, and to our Indigenous communities. Those areas might include social emotional development, gross fine motor skills, academics, cognition, growth might be of interest. Another topic that has to be discussed is the impact on instructional time and of course, system redundancy between district assessment systems and state assessment systems. We will want to make sure that we wouldn't be putting more assessment on the plate, that we would be doing at least a substitute. And as I shared, there are substantial concerns regarding the kindergarten assessment in terms of design, implementation, and outcomes. We do feel that the importance of gathering evidence of learning at the early grades remains. And the data that we were gathering around the kindergarten assessment showed that between kindergarten and third grade, kindergarten and fourth grade, fifth grade, that our systems were not serving our students of color, particularly our African-American students, well or appropriately. So we need to better understand why this is happening and use the information that we get to shine the light on effective practices as well as those that must adapt. Next slide, please. So the recommendation, you can mostly ignore the writing on the slide. The recommendation to the State Board of Education was that we waive the kindergarten assessment for fall 2021 because of those considerations, and the board adopted that suspension recommendation last Thursday. Should I cover both topics and then do questions, or would it be better if we kind of compartmentalize the kindergarten assessment questions first? I don't see any chat action.
Yeah, I think you could keep going, Dan. Thanks for checking.
Sure. All right, next slide, please. So the State Board, as I mentioned, has also waived the assessment of essential skills requirements. They had already done that for students who graduate this year. They have now done that for students who will graduate next year. So that's not just juniors, it's any student who's on an early path to graduation and will in fact graduate next year. It's important to mention, and I've gotten questions about this, that the suspension of the assessment of essential skills does not remove the personalized learning requirements. That includes the education plan and profile, nor does it remove local performance assessment requirements. So those are separate regulations. This particular suspension relates exclusively to the assessment of essential skills graduation requirements. We're also monitoring a Senate bill, local performance assessment. Local performance assessment might be part of that. Sorry if I didn't speak as clearly. Senate Bill 744, which is currently in an amended form, is one that we're monitoring related to essential skills. The bill would suspend the essential skills for 2 years out, so all the way through 22-23, and require ODE to study our graduation requirements in some, actually, to ensure that we are implementing such criteria and requirements in an equitable fashion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 9 essential skills, identify which 3 of those are assessed, and then explain a little bit about our rationale for recommending that the essential skills assessment of essential skills requirements be suspended. Next slide, please. So there are 9 essential skills in Oregon, and the latter 6 rarely get as much attention as the first 3, because the first 3 are assessed in a statewide manner, which was never the intent in terms of the framers of essential skills in the development process, but it is in fact where the process landed. So the essential skills were first developed in 2007, so it's been a while since they've received substantial attention. And then for students first enrolled in grade 9 in 2010, 11, or later, the 3 essential skills that you see highlighted in blue with white font here were part of assessment of essential skills graduation requirements. So students have to earn a score on an assessment administered and scored in standardized conditions in order to demonstrate proficiency on those first 3 areas. Those areas, of course, are reading, writing, and mathematics generally. And the other 6 essential skills were skills that students didn't necessarily need to meet in order to graduate, but were available. Next slide, please. So in Oregon, and this isn't always a well-known fact either, there are actually 4 assessment options that Oregon students can use to meet the proficiency requirements within the assessment of essential skills OAR. All 4 options must be secure, and all 4 therefore require in-person testing, which of course is challenging given the limited instructional time that we have available this school year and the unpredictability of local health and safety conditions. So our data that we collect at ODE suggests that the majority of students meet their essential skills requirements, assessment of essential skills requirements, using our state summative assessments in both language arts, which is the reading and writing subscores, as well as mathematics. Very few meet the requirements using locally developed assessments, which is the 4th option here. I have to share one caveat to that, which is that the data entered is typically based on the way or the order in which the student first meets their assessment of essential skills requirements. So it may be heavily favoring statewide summative assessment in some cases, because that's typically the first filter of the data collection effort, if that makes sense. There are also some students we want to acknowledge who meet their assessment of essential skills in multiple ways. So there's some students who take the state summative assessment and take another standardized assessment such as the ACT and or the SAT and meet work samples in addition, possibly collected at 9th grade. So the data aren't as clean as they might be. Nonetheless, a lot of students lean on the state summative assessment to meet their assessment of essential skills requirements. So this year, due to the pandemic and several factors related to instructional time, we're aware that districts are taking multiple pathways to state summative assessment administration. At the time that we presented this information to the board, we weren't sure about what our state summative assessment plan would be. But we do have, and we did develop shortened test blueprints in English language arts and mathematics this year in order to minimize the impact of our state assessments on instructional time. One of the consequences of those shortened test blueprints is that they could not generate reliable subscores in reading and writing separately. So only composite language arts scores will be made available to districts this year from our English language arts assessment. So that basically interferes with the students' ability to use the state summative assessment scores from this spring to meet essential skills requirements as well. And any other options would rely primarily on work samples or possibly purchasing standardized assessments through the another standardized assessment option. All of those require time and effort that we know most of our education systems don't have as a luxury item right now. We also knew that there are, because of the data that we look at, there are differential patterns that exist in the data in terms of how different student groups generally meet their assessment of essential skills requirements. I'll give one example of several, which is that 56% of our students who are African American meet their math proficiency requirements using work samples. Work samples are locally scored based on state approved scoring guides. That is in contrast to only 21% of students who are white meeting their math proficiency requirement with a work sample. So there are some disparities in the data that are called to our attention that are based on race, ethnicity that we're concerned about as well. So the final recommendation was that basically this is the wrong year for accountability, and individual student accountability is certainly one of the areas that we should remove from the system. It's not the time to hold students accountable for an education system during a pandemic. And that was the recommendation to the state board, which they accepted. And that is the final slide.
Thank you so much, Dan. Appreciate all the information and a thoughtful update. Just wanted to, I'm not tracking any assessment questions in the chat, but wanted to just give a pause. I know sometimes we're given really good feedback to slow down, which is a beautiful thing when we're all moving fast. So I just want to give a thoughtful pause related to assessment. And look at that, you pause and a beautiful question arises. Thank you, Colleen, for your question. The question is, can parents opt out of the SEED survey?
The SEED survey, good question, Karen, thank you. The SEED survey is a district option. If parents do not want their child to participate in the situation where the district has chosen to participate, that's a parent request is sufficient. There are no formal documentation requirements for that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for the update, Dan. Much appreciated. And if you think of a question, if you have one, and it comes to you later, please put it in the chat and we'll address it there. I also wanted to make sure that you have this resource available. There's lots of energy and interest around summer learning. So this is a website that was put together to support people in thinking about the House Bill 5042A and the money that will and resources available for the summer academic support grants at the high school level, the summer enrichment academic program grants at the K-8 level, and the school childcare grants at the K-5 level. So that link is there if it's helpful. And it looks like, Dan, there's a couple more follow-up questions around the SEED survey from Tanya, who says, if a student opts out of the assessments, does that mean they opt out of the SEED survey? Are they two separate things, which is what I think you just said. Can you reiterate the idea that they're different entities?
Yeah, there's yet another entity, which is, we have a complicated process for parents to choose to remove their child from testing. So there's one process that's called the parent opt-out, which only applies to English language arts and math summative assessments. There's a separate process that is a parent exemption process that is in place for science. So for the SEED survey, it is a completely separate optional student survey that doesn't have an opt-out or an exemption requirement. So it's an instructional activity, and parents could simply request that their child not participate if they desire for them not to participate. And that only is in place in districts that are choosing to administer the SEED survey. So if your district doesn't administer the SEED survey, there's no action required in that regard. All of the items for the SEED survey are published on ODE's assessment team webpage so that parents can actually look at the questions their child will be asked prior to making that decision as well. And we've shared communication resources with district test coordinators to share with parents about what the SEED survey is and their options about participation for their child as well. I can link to in the chat.
All right, beautiful. Just wanted to name the slide deck. Ashley, if you could post the slide deck again, and Troy, I know that was posted earlier, but I want to make sure that everybody has access to it. So the link to the slide deck, which includes the content that Dan just covered, so that you can be sure to have it at your disposal. All right, so Scott, we've had some questions come to us in private chat. So my recommendation would be first we address those and then we open it up, or do you have a different approach that feels better?
That sounds just fine. We can do that, and then
Okay.
Folks can also unmute and jump in, but let's go ahead and clear out some of the first messages.
Okay, beautiful. So I think we'll kick off with the first question that we got in the chat, and it is, please consider addressing and revisiting the updates about 3-foot, 6-foot guidance. I continue to field questions about implementing 3 feet distancing, but I'm really unclear how to maintain 6-foot distance at meal times. Folks, even some LPHA staff seem to lack clarity around this, and scenarios still define close contact as within 6 feet. It's very important as more schools consider that 3-foot option.
So I guess part one, like we're receiving the feedback, so we will take that and pass it on. I think I want to be as clear as I can about some things that are I experience them as kind of clear and hard.
That was pretty perfect. He said he wanted to get really clear and then he froze. So Scott Nunn, I know the internet has not been your friend today.
All day. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Man, this has been my
I know.
all day phenomenon. So I'll take my camera off and jump into unmute. Or let me know if I freeze again.
We'll let you know.
So I think some things are clear and hard, and some things people might not like or agree to, and then other things might be confusing or worth another look. So I just try to break those down. So our current guidance is unchanged. That sets parameters for elementary schools at 3 feet of physical distance if they want to, and very specific parameters for middle and high schools, and they have to kind of meet metrics in a particular way. What the question's asking about is about when you're at 3 feet, you still have to be at 6 feet for mealtime. That's critically important from a CDC and OHA standpoint, and I know probably drives schools in fits. So I know lots of emails in the last few weeks about how to do that. And I understand that for many places, they figured out how to do lunch by using a combination of larger physical building space, outdoor space, and classroom space, but really puzzling on breakfast. And many folks have just kind of broken down to going back to essentially like box, not hot food for breakfast for over the course of a week, and getting food out in the evening times to be able to figure out how to do that at the school day, which is far from ideal, but we're balancing health and safety with food distribution. And, you know, I'll leave it to, we are often joined by colleagues from OHA on the call, and I could leave it to them and the epidemiologists about why this is important. But if only logistics were driving the decision-making, we wouldn't have any of the limitations we have. And in this case, we're following the epidemiologists and public health folks, and they still believe it's really important that we maintain 6 feet when we're eating. So you have to be creative and come up with designs that are uncomfortable and hard. And that's just what it is. That it's not feasible, you know, is a big, I think it's good for people to share with each other how you're solving for it, because people are all across the state. And we may need to do a better job of kind of sharing knowledge about how people are solving for that. So that's a one chunk of it. When it relates to the close contact and case investigation, that's a specific public health standard and remains in place in terms of contact tracing. It's an important variable for schools who decide to operate down at 3 feet to understand that as it relates to contact logs, and in the case that you might have an outbreak of some kind. And hopefully we've headlined that from the beginning. Maybe someone can say more about, and that's one that's, again, it's hard, but I don't think it's unclear. Like people might just not like the implications of it. So, you know, like, if someone has like an operationally, like, other than I don't like it and it's hard, like, you know, I think that's just what it is. But happy to hear feedback if there's something else, and we will pass on that it's, you know, people want it to be revisited, but I think that's what I have to offer, Jennifer.
That's super helpful. I hope that was helpful to those listening. I know sometimes it's like, you know, the things that are hard stay hard, and there's not really an easy way through it or around it necessarily. But
did my compassion come through, Jennifer, or did I just sound like a grump? I'm
well,
super
I
empathetic.
was gonna say
I have no facial expression, so you can't see that I'm like really cheering you all on, and I know it's totally irritating and annoying.
You did sound a little bit like me when I try to get McKenna to eat her vegetables. Like, I don't care if it makes you gag, you're eating that broccoli. But no, I'm just teasing. All in good spirit. I mean, I think that's what we need, right? Is there's this level of, this is hard, and this is what the moment calls for and asks of us, and compassion and acknowledgement of why it's hard. So I mean, hopefully we can create space for both things with each other. And
yeah.
Okay, I think Danny has a question about breakfast. So since we're staying with like distancing and food and eating, I thought maybe connect to Dandy's question, because for what it's worth, definitely feeling that you're not alone in the challenge around food and eating and arrival in the morning. So she's saying, I can't stagger 400 elementary students arriving between 7:45 and 8:15 and still get middle and high school in and get them their breakfast.
Yeah.
So just kind of wondering if this might be a place and a space. Has anybody cracked this and successfully solved for this? Could anyone be a resource for Dandy around this problem of practice?
So here's what I know, but I welcome someone to sound off that they've solved it if there's someone on the call who has. So Dandy, good to see you. You're not alone. There was a thread, 10 days ago maybe, where several different folks were emailing me versions of this question, including some creative, not viable solutions about how to approach trying to solve this that we ran through with OHA. And where we got to was essentially, there's a small work group, which I can loop you, and if other people are interested, into this, trying to puzzle other ways to do this, but where we got to, including with OHA, was like, if you are serving breakfast in kind of routine ways and trying to move through speed and time and food, that at the moment, keeping that 6 feet and breakfast and timing is just not viable. And so you have some folks are designing, trying to do some like, how do you do staggered welcomes and breakfast after the bell? But mostly what folks have done is go back to meal distribution, and no one likes that. And that's what they're doing. They're serving kids their breakfast meals they're delivering to families for the entire week or for a couple of days at a time, and not serving breakfast at school. And people don't want to do that, but that's the avenue that people have been able to figure out how to functionally get kids breakfast. So I don't, and again, I'll be quiet in case someone else on the call has solved this in a larger size system, but I'm not aware of a solve. And that's the best that people have figured out that I know of, which I know is not a satisfying answer.
And County is offering, what about breakfast in the classroom? And I know that that works for some people, depends on square footage of classroom is what I've heard, and how
That's
many
right.
children.
That's right.
So I think that works if you've got these big, beautiful, spacious classrooms and few children. Otherwise, that hasn't been offered a solution for some.
Is it okay?
Yeah,
if
go
I
ahead,
make-
Andy.
Yeah, so Jervis has been doing home meal distribution since actually the shutdown began and before we had permission from the National Food Program to do it. So in this little district, we have since last March served almost 600,000 meals, which, last week, no slam against Lake Oswego, I saw they were saying, oh, we've served 500,000 meals. I'm like, well, yeah, and your district is like 9 times bigger than mine. So we have been doing that, and we are exhausted. And at the same time, we have a very high poverty rate. Those kids are not going to eat their breakfast before they come to school. If they could do that, even if they had it, they would do it before they even if we deliver it, they don't eat it necessarily. So, okay, I get all of that. But I think that when we start looking at problem solving, like I've seen other states where they have the plexiglass barriers in their kids with their pods, and they're 3 feet apart eating. I have these little contact tracing devices, which will tell me exactly who you've been in contact with at however many feet for 15 or more minutes in 30 seconds. And then we have testing. So I think if we're going to move forward in the fall, there needs to be outside the box thinking, because we've got it and it works, but I can't make it work with the buildings I have. So that's just my kind of level of frustration. My parents will not accept this in September. So I have to come up with something else.
I hear the frustration, and legitimately, and we'll certainly, both pass it on to.
I think Scott froze again. But Dandy, I appreciate, I think it's really helpful for us to actually, have authentic emotion in the space. So thank you for naming what's feeling real, and that we hear you saying you've got to have a different solution by the fall. So hearing that and appreciating that. There's definitely some questions and interest around open campus and lunch. And so, Scott, I don't know if you're hearing this, but there's one question here in the chat. We've been open since January 24th. Our high school has an open campus, and we are keeping numbers down. Actually, the high school kids are eating with the same kids they eat with all the time. And knock on wood, we've not had a breakout at our high school. Our high school is 1,000 students. And other people saying, are you going to put anything out in RSSL around open campus and what's required? So Scott, I don't know I don't actually know the answer to that. My best guess would be likely not. But certainly if that's feeling like something that would be really helpful, potentially we could absolutely bring it back to our RSSL core team for feedback.
I hope I'm back, Jennifer.
Yes, you're back. Yay.
And I typed in the chat, Dandy, what I could offer. I missed the first part, Jennifer, so I got all the second half, but not what the headline subject was.
Open campus and lunch. So
It's not formally stated as something you cannot do, and every time we've brought it up, well, whoever's writing now is the first time I've seen anyone, and they've sent it privately, recommend it. To date, everyone who's tried it has quickly ran away from it that I'm familiar with, but I don't anticipate that we would bring something that would specifically say do or don't do, given that we haven't so far, and I'd imagine going into the fall. So if that's a big issue, we could respond, but I don't anticipate we would change anything at this time.
thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. Some friends that are joining late, welcome. Appreciate having you. And yes, essential skills have been waived. The State Board of Ed waived them just last week. So wanted to make sure you had that update. And Ashley, if you could put the slides in the chat again, then folks have that as well. Scott, there is a question that I think is worth raising. There are some worried members that are hearing from leaders that Oregon Department of Education and OHA are going to remove the mask mandate before the end of the year. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, we can put the variables document. Ashley, maybe you can pull that in. We released this, I don't 6-8 weeks ago. Should help leaders plan for the fall, and named what would be constant and what might change. And face covering is one of the things that we said would be a constant. And anything you're hearing about that, I would highly mark in the conjecture and rumor, and nothing tied to reality that I'm aware of. So that's all I can really say about that. But we can surface that document so you can see what we said you kind of need to plan for. Outside's a different thing. When you're beyond 6 feet, there are variables there, but the idea that we won't wear face coverings inside school buildings in the fall in some form is not something I have not an ounce of that being accurate. So I would encourage you to interrupt that and point people to this variables document for their planning.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Scott. I think in the same kind of vein, Mark Siegel is asking a question around disinfecting and cleaning. And my best answer there is that the RSSL guidance stands, and I don't believe there's any plans of updating that.
So that one's a little more complicated than the face coverings. So the CDC has come out relatively recently. Some of you know that, depending on your perspective, and think the role of what formerly are called fomites, and man, we have OHA colleagues on, they should have please jump in and say what's true, or that one of the nurses on can say more. But the understanding about the role of cleaning sanitation has definitely changed significantly over time. Our OHA was hesitant pre-changing CDC guidance to adjust that, and I think there's still some humility around variance and other dynamics that could keep that shifting. But I do think in the area of variables, you'll see that cleaning and disinfecting is one of the variables that could change because of that changing science. So I do think there's a good chance, maybe not for the, I don't want to conject too far, but because we really will follow OHA. So, OHA could come out in the next week or two and change it, or they could come for the summer, or it could be for the fall. But I do think that different than face coverings, that one likely will shift at some point. It's more a matter of like when and with what caution. But that one is a bit different as a variable.
Thank you, Scott. Another question that is around testing and staff and what's required. Got a private chat that said we were informed on Friday that mandatory weekly COVID-19 screening testing for staff will start this month and remain for the rest of the school year. And then we'll implement screening testing in K-12 students next year. Will this guidance come out in an updated RSSL, or how will we be notified when this should start?
We should probably put this, Jennifer, on the agenda for the next office hours
Okay.
to dig into. So what's, and I'll see if either Kati can be on or we can have someone from OHA on. So the short version now, but really much more time to discuss, is the CDC working through public health is inviting states to participate in what is formerly like a serial or surveillance testing program. So instead of the BinaxNOW symptomatic testing that we do, they're inviting people to participate. And the way they're inviting that to happen is for on the educator side of things, is for educators to participate directly through their own home process of being mailed kits that they can self-administer and participate in this kind of surveillance testing program. And that's begun to get introduced in Oregon. And it'd be worth, I think, taking time to explain like what that is and isn't. What I'm hearing in the private chat is the part about like it being mandatory. What I want to sort out, Jennifer, in the presentation is like what's being invited and then how districts might be choosing to operate with that invitation, and where there could be a lot of variance in message and it work really different. So I think we just need to dig in on that newer program, and it's a program through OHA, not formally through ODE, and it's not tied to any of the like RSSL requirements or recommendations, but we would do well to do some like sharing about what that is and what's being thought about for the fall. My memory is something like $50 to $100 million being dedicated to this kind of idea from the CDC to OHA, but I want to do a little more homework and make sure that we're all have the same information.
Thank you so much. Sounds like Ashley's getting a private chat. I think we're all getting private chats and we're trying to share them with each other. So someone's saying to her, that is what they're using in Wyoming for state employees. They're self-testing every 14 days with Vault. So
yeah, I don't know what Vault is. I assume maybe
don't
someone
either.
else does. Is Vault a type of testing? Is that, I don't know if that's a company or a type of, I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, again, we'll center that next time, because I think it'll be useful maybe to get a little more clarity about what is and isn't in place in pretty early days. And I don't have all the information just yet. So we'll work on some homework to bring that in front of everybody.
Super helpful, Scott. I'm going to switch topics next, and we're going to talk about bus cohorts. Bus cohort quarantines are not an RSSL, only scenarios. Maybe we need some more clarification. And a second question shared as part of ongoing discussion, negotiating, I don't know why that's shared there. Sorry, I'm having a hard time. Looks like two questions got in the same place. So anything we could share more about bus cohorting and RSSL?
Yeah, so the bus quarantines are not in RSSL. Quarantines are in RSSL, and partnering with your LPHA is in RSSL, and having contact logs is in RSSL, including for your buses. And the reason that it's not in RSSL is because it's left for some complexity in terms of scenarios. So there are situations where either out of lack of bandwidth at an LPHA or because of the nature of the kind of spread, that whole buses can and need to be quarantined. And there are other times in situations in where, given the nature of the situation, the amount of minutes and time, a quarantine can be shrunk down based on kind of the quick kind of contact identification and contact tracing. And this really is tied to like the coordination with the school and the LPHA and capacity, and it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, which is why it's not a firm rule. The issues are really what the scenarios are for, which is not to answer every single question, but give a guide. And then you got to work through the actual situations in real time. So, if we want to address a specific situation, we could talk through what a scenario, but that's not the same as how do you handle a possible quarantine. And I welcome, we've got like 30 nurses on the call. So like if anyone want to disagree or align, feel free to jump in and correct me. But
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. I also, I did the same thing. I just said, hey, any OHA folks in the room, if you can answer this question in the chat about text, that would be super helpful, because I want to make good use of our last 8 minutes together.
That one, the Binax Now one, I have an answer that we've circulated, but people maybe lost track of. So
go for it, Scott 9.
Yeah, so the company sent out a written memo extending the timeline for the use of those Binax Now tests. And it's on the OHA school testing website. I see other folks nodding their heads. So if you missed that memo, I want to get you more specific information. I don't know if I have it at my fingertips. Someone else might on the call. They put out, Abbott, I believe is the name of the company, and they put out a specific letter that was national and shared across Oregon that allows for those tests to have, a little bit a more extended use per the FDA. So don't throw out the tests, and we'll try to get that document or letter in front of you. You can always write the school testing coordinator at DHS to get that memo as well. But let me see if I can find it.
Beautiful. Thanks, Scott 9. Hopefully, James, that helped you with your question. Also want to just track Aaron. Ken Greenbaum put a link in there where we speak to retention, but I want to suggest that we speak toward retention at next office hours. So thanks for surfacing that. And we'll be sure to spend a little bit of time kind of previewing what we know of our retention and what we say in this document here, to the extent that that's helpful for people. There's also, I think, an important question that I wanted to make sure that we address, Scott, for people. Two things. One, Cammie's asking a really good question. If everyone who wants to be vaccinated has an opportunity to be vaccinated by August, why wouldn't we just move forward with relatively normal safety measures?
This is one where we might want to. We're stacking up quite a future playlist for future office hours.
In office hours today, Scott 9.
But that might be one where we haven't asked Dr. Tom Jean or Dr. Seidlinger to join us, but we might either ask them or ask them to do a little, deck work or recording. I think because I feel a little at the edge of like, I'm really passing on information as opposed to holding the expertise to explain. So I'll share a tiny nugget, and then really, we should have the actual experts. But I'm checking. I didn't think I saw Kristen Hollywood sometimes join us from OHA. She could speak to it as well. We're not going to do justice to it. The short version is like, one, you don't have a fully vaccinated community, and then you don't have fully vaccinated children. And then we have to hold a lot of humility around new variants. And I know the deep desire to just have things go back like to some prior normal. And my colleague Katsi Mosey has been talking about like how we need to kind of like adapt forward with a fluency around communicable disease. We certainly should be able to get back to a lot of ways that people might feel more comfortably functioning, but it's just not so simple yet. And we'll hope that it will be. And the summer is going to reveal a lot, but there's just not a readiness to do that. But there are some real threats that remain. And that's where I don't feel quite comfortable really breaking that down as much as to have epidemiologists talk about like, what are the public health and safety risks we're not done with? And though we want to be done, we're not. And people don't have a lot of room for that. They don't have a lot of room to hear it. And some people don't have a lot of room to believe it. That doesn't make it not true. And so I know that in terms of what is navigating public health response is trying to take a really balanced view of those risks and benefits and trade-offs and come up with then policy decisions tied to that set of views. And so, but again, let's add that to the, maybe we can get someone with more formal expertise to speak to some of that.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I just appreciate, Scott, I quoted you in the chat because I thought it was pretty perfect. It's just not so simple yet, which is unfortunate because we wish that it could be more straightforward and simple. And I know we're all exhausted and yearning for a simpler, more straightforward way of being with each other again. I do think in the spirit of what Scott's suggesting, which is bringing some OHA expertise to office hours next week, if you've got a really specific question that you'd like to pose to Tom Jean or Dean Seilinger, depending on who we might be able to align for next week or the week following, please put it in the chat and we'll help to track that so that we can preview those questions with them and that we make good use of your time by making sure that your questions are centered and addressed. So we really appreciate hearing what you're wondering. And then someone else is asking me, Jennifer, what about next year? What about next year? Which is a really good question. And I think one, Scott, we should end with, not that we have a simple solution for that, but I do want to let people know that we are beginning to put some structure and thought to next year. In terms of timeline, people are saying, do you have a definitive timeline and when we might get guidance or clarity around next year? And I would say not yet, but Scott, do you have any refining to provide to my answer?
Well, the only thing I would say is, we're probably about 6 weeks away from what we're talking about as a kind of discussion draft. So some of the architecture of what we think might inform the fall. And when we get to that, we'll definitely bring that in around through office hours, as well as many other circles of engagement through communities and families and educators. And then we're going to take that round of input and then work at the actual architecture of what would be fall guidance. That variables documents our best input at this point. It tracks the things that we're thinking about and have our attention. And, somewhere somewhere between the 15th and the end of July, we will produce what we think will be the fall guidance with a lot of humility around. We'd love that to be guidance that won't change all the time. It doesn't have a bunch of iterations. We'd love for that to be the conditions we're in. We'd cheer on that being the case. And also I say that like knock on every substance that you all know so we don't jinx ourselves into that. So that gives you like a rough idea of how we're going to approach building that kind of guidance and when you can look for it. So kind of discussion input outline in about 6 weeks and much more fully in place mid to late July. That's about the best we can offer right now. We're tending to all these same variables and working our way through it. And teams are building and we're starting to write and draft and think through that architecture.
Beautiful. Thank you, Scott. And we also just want to invite your questions if you have anything. I'm getting some in private chat. And so please bring forward any questions that you'd appreciate us speaking to next week. And it was a pleasure to spend 60 minutes with you. Thanks for your authentic questions and the shared inquiry. Thanks for helping each other. It was really nice to see how your what can help pollinate the space. That's always beautiful and refreshing. And Scott and I, thanks for being patient with internet troubles. That's always very real.
Good teamwork. Thank you for your always gracious hosting, Jennifer.
Absolutely.
And, I'm very entertained, and I know they're serious questions by the range of outdoor sports. So we'll have to track that in for next outdoor wrestling.
All right, friends. Thanks so much. Thanks for the good work you do, and appreciation too for flexibility. I know the Zoom link has changed, and so thanks for helping to respond to that little technical detail and shift on our end. So big appreciation for your time. Have a great day. Take care.